In this episode, we look at a character who inspired the entire modern superhero genre. He's the Man of Steel, the last son of Krypton, the Man of Tomorrow. Say it with me. Faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive, able to leap tall buildings in a single bound. Look, up in the sky. It's a bird. It's a plane. No, it's Superman. Here we go. And here we are again for another episode of Greatest Characters in Pop Culture History. And my guest today is one of my dearest friends, all the way back to grade school. He introduced me to Superman, I think, at least the version that I fell in love with. My friend Will Calves. Hello, Will. So happy to have you here.
How are you, Nick? It's good to be here. It's good to be part of this.
Do you remember when you got me that Superman encyclopedia?
Yes, I actually do.
I read that cover to cover.
It was quite the book. I don't know who put it out. I want to say DC Comics put it out themselves, but I don't remember if it was something that was like, part of a tie-in to the movie, which was
it had to have been,
it was a 1978. The Christopher Reeve production. It had all sorts of references and cross references. It would mention some major and minor characters, of course, but if it mentioned
everything.
A major character, a minor character, it was always referenced, like first appeared in, Superman number whatever, or Action Comics number, whatever it might have been. And and then that was also the era when DC Comics was, they sort of had the golden age comics as almost like a separate,
right? Because they were
universe.
Exactly. That's when they were playing up Earth 1, Earth 2, Earth a billion, whatever it was. It was so complicated, and you needed these like encyclopedias to keep track of everything that was going on. Is there anyone, do you think, that's never heard of Superman?
So you mean like anywhere on Earth, right outside the United States and in Western civilization? I'm sure there must be, but I would also say it's sort of the kind of folks that, given not just the pop culture phenomenon that the comic books created and that the movies have created over the years, all the various reboots of movies. But I would say with the, the television shows, all the various television shows that must now, with streaming networks and everything, carrying American popular culture around the world in many cases, I'm sure that most folks have heard of him. There must be some that haven't, and I'm sure there are a few diehard Marvel Cinematic Universe types that don't even know that he exists. There must be one or two of them out there. But yeah, I think most folks have heard of him. I mean, I think it's a recognition. They always trying to, I feel like DC Comics is also always trying to keep the audience engaged and a little fresh. They don't always do the best job of it, but like when we were kids, you look back and you realize the whole golden age heroes and, with their slightly 1940s and 50s, outfits and how different they were from the 70s with the sculpted muscles that, the artists were drawing in the 70s and everything. It was an obvious difference. That was their attempt then to keep people who are our age now, engaged in the comics.
What they grew up with, right?
What they grew up with. And so it's,
you had like the barrel-chested George Reeves type Superman with the more slim Christopher Reeves, right, kind of Superman, and in the comics playing up on those, right? So But so this was created in 1938 by two friends, right? It was writer Jerry Siegel and artist Joe Shuster.
Right.
So
From Cleveland, remember, if I remember correctly.
Yep. And, every kid's fantasy about being a mild-mannered person who suddenly has this secret identity. Interesting enough, right? The secret identity is the one that's really wearing the disguise, the glasses. It's the hero who, he's one of the few that doesn't wear a mask as a hero. He is Superman for all intents and purposes.
Exactly.
Right?
And he comes out, he has this, as I understand it, and you could probably correct me if I'm wrong here because you probably know more specifics at this point about the early years of Superman. And by the way, I have not seen yet the David Corenswet movie, which
it's great. I liked it a lot.
I know I got it, which I got to go see it. Don't worry, I will see. But what's interesting to me is, as I understand it, in the very early years, he wasn't quite as super as he evolved into, like, certainly by the 70s and 80s, where it got almost to the point of satire. Like there was nothing that could kill him except, short
Mhm.
of kryptonite or something.
Yeah.
And in the early years, he was strong, but as we were, as we were mentioning, he also had his weaknesses. He has kryptonite. He has his personality. He wants to do good. And to me, it's very emblematic of when he was created, right? In the Depression, the height of the Great Depression. I mean, maybe not the height. It might have been already sort of past the
Right.
curve of the worst of it,
Yeah.
but sort of this recognition that like all these great things, like a nation can be the strong, great nation, and yet you can have these weaknesses,
For
these
sure.
things that create agita and anxiety and fear and all the things that were happening in the States in the
Yeah.
1930s.
Yeah. A
And
lot of
so it's
crazy things going on around the
yeah,
world too, you know.
especially around the world, but right, it's the kind of thing that I feel shows that he's very much a character of his time, that these two guys create him in Cleveland and
Yeah.
and just sell him. And I guess at the time, right, it wasn't his own title, as they say in the comic book
It was
world, right? He was Action
action
Comics.
comics, number one.
But I don't know. This is where I'm ignorant on the fact as to whether or not Action Comics had any other heroes, or if it was just a Superman vehicle, so to
Yeah.
speak. I don't know. I actually don't know.
Yeah, and I wish I had a copy myself, that because it would be worth millions right now, you know.
Who doesn't? Sorry
But
for the free product placement there.
that's
I
all right.
apologize.
But that's where you were talking about how he was not this totally super powerful kind of character. You just look at that radio tagline, right? Faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive,
Right.
able to leap tall buildings. So he literally was jumping. He wasn't flying yet
right.
at the
It wasn't
beginning,
necessarily flying,
you know?
right?
But still,
Exactly.
that was amazing imagination that these two young guys kind of came up with. I remember when we were younger, we tried to create our own little comic book and sell it for like a nickel to our classmates. And what we were doing is basically ripping off every other superhero we read in the comics. We weren't really making something super creative, right?
This
Like,
is true.
he
We were a
took-
late 1970s version of AI. Yes, we were taking,
Exactly.
a biologic version of AI. We were taking everyone else's intellectual property and melding it.
We basically took like the Superman motif and just changed the colors of his cape and his costume, put a mask on him maybe. Or
I think we might have put a mask on him.
But yeah, they were two Jewish boys looking at the world and what was going on in Europe, and they were from immigrant families, and all these things kind of play into the character, and they were inspired probably by the other heroes like Zorro and the Scarlet Pimpernel was something from the late 1800s, these stories. But none of these characters had like superpowers to the level that Superman had. There was apparently a novel that came out in 1930 called Gladiator by Philip Wiley. I have never read it, but apparently that character had like Superman-like powers. So I'm sure they were inspired by something like that. And then you look at his costume and he looks like one of those circus strongmen and maybe wrestlers of the time, with the underwear outside the tights, right? So they probably took some of those inspirations like that. But it was so groundbreaking, so different from what people had seen before, that suddenly people, give credit to Superman as being what opened the floodgates, and suddenly you had Batman and all these others. And in the 1960s, Marvel reinvented a lot of
when
heroes
Stan
like
Lee
Captain
sort of
America and all these others.
Comes out with all his characters.
So
no, I always find his not his literal origin story in the comic book franchise and in the the imagination, but rather his literal origin story to be interesting because, like you said, right, these were two Jewish American young men, Jerry Siegel, Joe Shuster. They're living in Cleveland, and they create a superhero that, in some ways, people mention as like a Christian allegory to it. There's this father who sends his son to Earth, to save us, to save the human beings and humanity from itself, essentially, which is. It's kind of an interesting, it's an interesting hook on Superman that you don't really think of all the time. And sometimes it's the whole messianic backstory to him is something that I think some folks don't always see it, don't always recognize that it's there, but it's something that's, that's certainly noticeable once you see it. It's hard to unsee it a little bit.
And then some of the filmmakers certainly played up on it. I really think the Christopher Reeve stuff is definitely playing up on those themes.
Right.
You see some of the other, the iconography, like you say, they totally play up on it. And it's
Right.
also Moses, right? Also the story of Moses coming
Correct.
from the Hebrew scriptures, right? Putting this savior, I guess, into a
Right.
pod, or a basket in the case of
Yep.
Moses, and having him go to this other land and becomes the savior of his people, right? Right. So it's there. Yeah, you read the text and it's like all there. It's not like
Yeah, they
we're
use all these elements, and it works well. And then of course the idea of Martha and Jonathan Kent is sort of being, Joseph and Mary, and like
right.
they are, they're simple. They live a simple life in I believe Kansas is where
Yep.
Smallville was supposed to be, and they're salt of the earth, good people who raise them with good morals and good ethics. If whether you go through the whole nature versus nurture argument, who knows? The point is that the kid was raised by these two earthlings,
Yeah.
who did a great job, and embedded in him all the morality of the character. It comes from his upbringing in Smallville, Kansas.
And he feels human. He feels, he falls in love with Lana Lang when he's young, with Lois Lane when he's older.
He has a
And
nemesis in Lex Luthor.
right.
The LL, the
Yeah,
double L's are
his
always
mom's
interesting.
name was Laura. If you look at that encyclopedia, like he fell in love with a mermaid called Lori Lemeris, right? The double L's, like it's everywhere.
That was I don't know about that. That storyline was a little much, but yeah.
But yeah, so that's that human, and I guess you were talking about he just kept getting more and more powerful. More, we
Right.
look at the powers, right? He could fly. He's invulnerable. He's super strong, super fast. Has super
Right.
hearing, X-ray vision, heat vision, super breath.
Name it. Right.
He's got.
It started
everything.
getting it almost like I don't want to say like ridiculous, but just to the point of a little bit of, a little much, what can actually do him in. And I remember when we were young, there would be all the back and forth of like, well, who could actually take him on? Who could take him on? Who could actually take him down? Oh, Green Lantern, because he could make green kryptonite, and this, that, and the other. And it's like, oh God, okay. So it became the kind of thing where I think the writers kind of always felt they had to back themselves into a corner bit because they always had to come up with someone who could be strong enough to defeat him. In a lot of ways, they would always choose other Kryptonians.
Yep.
People who had managed to make it to Earth's yellow sun.
Yeah.
Which was, by the way, another very much of the era. I don't know when they first explained that. It's probably early in the Action Comics run when they try and explain, well, why is it that he has this powerful ability?
Yeah, it was definitely during the
super
Silver
strength.
Age too. Like
The Silver Age. Thank you. I kept calling you the Golden Age, but I think that's right.
Well,
I
the
think they
Golden
call it
Age
the
was
Silver Age.
the beginning where it's like they didn't really care how. They were just like,
They
he's
didn't
got
care how,
superpowers, right?
Right.
But yeah, Silver
But
Age.
like
they're trying to-
1945 comes, I feel, and
Yeah, around
Stan
there,
Lee
maybe
goes with this later. Stan Lee uses this a lot later, like radiation, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's the Hulk
Mhm.
or a radioactive spider,
Spider-Man, right? Yeah.
But after the war and the dropping of the atomic bombs on Japan that ended the war, I think it became the kind of thing where there has to be some kind of scientific explanation. There has to be something, like how Star Trek always tries to explain something with technology by trying to somehow mold it into something that seems to make some level of plausibility. Right. Same thing. Oh, Krypton had a red sun. And so, or Krypton, as Marlon Brando so famously mispronounces it in the movie when he's playing Jor-El. Krypton had a red sun. Earth has a yellow sun, yellow star. And this is why, So, of course, that means anybody that comes from there and lands here
right
has these same superpowers.
Right. And then at first it was like, also Earth had weaker gravity, but now so the powers kept changing, right? And they started like getting into more like really weird kind of technology stuff. Like there was this thing called tactile telekinesis, which I was like, I didn't even know that was a power, but apparently it was one of the writers trying to explain why when he was holding up a building by one edge, or when he was holding up a plane by the nose, or when he caught somebody falling from a really high depth, the bones didn't just shatter and the building didn't just crumble. So apparently like it's a way to kind of explain, okay, here's a loophole, whereas you're looking at the comics, you're like, well, that's not physically possible, right? Even if you, so yeah.
Even if you had super strength.
Even
right,
now, they continue to, and I see writers trying to explain, the heat vision and the X-ray vision and how they're connected, and it's about kind of like the way you focus your eyes. It's great. As a geek when I was growing up, I ate that stuff up,
Right.
And, I loved it. But again, all these powers, how do you find a weakness? And to your point, it's like he's human in the sense that he's got vulnerabilities. He was raised by these two kind people, Jonathan and Martha, who instilled in him some sense of morality or, our version of what we think morality is, right?
Right.
And
Mid
he's here
20th
for a
century
reason.
American morality.
And
Right.
I think that Christopher Reeve movie really nailed it with that scene with his dad, Glenn Ford, right? The actor who played
Yep.
Jonathan. That scene when he's like, "You are here for a reason. It's not to play football, right? It's not to kick the ball the farthest. I don't know what it is, but you are here for a reason." And then when he dies from the heart attack, he's like, "All these powers, and I still couldn't save him."
Couldn't say
So
him.
you see his
Right.
emotions are what like kind of hold him back. Every time his villains go after Lois Lane or Jimmy Olsen, that's his weakness because he can't, he doesn't want to see people suffer, doesn't want to see people die. And I guess that's why Lex Luthor maybe is probably his greatest villain because it's mind over brawn, right? It's that kind of conflict.
Right.
And here's someone who has no morals, who's very selfish, who's, very jealous of Superman versus somebody who's like, I
Right.
don't,
I'm not sure Luther is amoral or if he's just
yeah,
supposed to be pure evil.
yeah,
But, yeah, it's an interesting character.
yeah,
Some of the better villains and the better characters in general are just, they're really interesting because, the whole relationship with General Zod, I think was invented basically for the movie in the 70s.
yeah. And
I
now
think
he's
that
part of the canon and he's
he's
in the
right. He's
comics
sort
and
of
they
come
bring him
into
back.
the whole, and Terrence Stamp, of course, just passed away at
Yeah.
the time we were
He
recording
was
this. Terrence
so
Stamp
good,
for a
especially in
week ago,
Superman
2 weeks
2.
ago. Yeah. But he was one of those characters who was in, by the way, everyone thinks of the Phantom Zone 3 as a Superman 2 invention, but it is,
They
in
were
the
in the first
beginning
one, yeah.
sequence of the first movie. And that's something in it's like that was a great way to adapt something that was in the original comic books because the Phantom
The
Zone
Phantom
is in
Zone.
there. But then they show it in the movies and it's like, is it really better than just flat out executing them? They're to spend eternity flattened into this crystalline thing moving through
Right.
space and time.
I
I
know.
don't know. I mean, it sounds like a pretty horrific sentence. The Kryptonians have they would have had an interesting moral
Yeah.
structure, which I'm not sure what they
Well,
ever really
that's what's
fully
so great
explored.
about these comic books, right? Because it's like on the surface level, they're very simple, good versus evil, very cliched stories. But the more you dig into it and the more writers really try to make it a little bit more complex, it's like you start raising all these questions like, would Batman be better off killing the Joker instead of letting him live to kill all these other people, right? And, the Superman code, don't kill anyone, the same thing with Lex Luthor. How many times is he going to break out of jail and try to take over the world and do all these things? So you start thinking about
Right.
that.
I mean,
And
some of
then,
that is plot
yeah,
devices, obviously, because they want to bring the character back.
exactly.
But no, it's a real question. And then you have like just the morality issues. And I know some of the different genres of movies and comic books have touched on this, but like relationships that he has with other superheroes, like Batman. Batman is essentially a vigilante.
Yeah.
Batman is, and I know we're talking about Superman here, but I think when you talk about Superman, you
They go
inevitably
hand
end
in
up
hand, right?
right.
The
You inevitably
brave and
compare
the
it to
bold
Bob
and
Kane's
world's finest.
Batman, right? And Batman is an extra legal vigilante who goes out and captures criminals. And yes, does he most of the time, especially by the time of the campy '60s Batman, just turn him in and he's just an arm, almost an arm of the Gotham Police Department. But Superman, if Batman was walking around Metropolis, Superman would probably have to like bring him in, and say, no, this guy's breaking the rules. It's got the kind of thing where, you have to balance, well, where are those rules? What are the lines? And it's something that he's always, that it seems that the character is always contending with. And that you're right. That emotional element is his weakness.
And I'm glad you brought up Batman because there is that contrast. You have the day that's associated with Superman and the night that's associated with Batman and the conflict. Metropolis is a lot grittier and, Metropolis is a lot brighter and more
Right.
technologically advanced, more like Manhattan, I guess. And Gotham City is more like the outer boroughs, maybe Brooklyn or the Bronx
The
or
story,
Queens,
the line that I've always heard,
Chicago,
which I think
right?
is a
Yeah.
great, no, the one I've heard, which I think is a great way of thinking about it sometimes, is Metropolis is New York in the daytime and
That's a good
Gotham
one.
is New York at night.
Excellent. Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, okay, that frames it a little bit. Now I know they've tried in recent times, they tried to like explain away, like, like Metropolis is Midwestern, some Great Lake city could be Chicago,
Mhm.
and Gotham is like, I think in some of the recent Batman movies, I show like maps and you see it's like somewhere in southern New Jersey or
Right.
northern Delaware, somewhere near Philadelphia or something.
Yeah.
But clearly I think in most productions, most adaptations, people see it as some form of New York, maybe Chicago, some of the one of the larger eastern or midwestern cities. But yeah, the night and day element is interesting, and Superman also their layers, right, for lack of a better term, because they're heroes, so they don't have layers; they just have a redoubt, right? Superman is this fortress of solitude, up in the middle of nowhere, in the Arctic, north of the Arctic Circle. That's all we know. And Batman's is Wayne Manor, the Batcave, underneath, a rich person's house, somewhere in, well, I guess in Gotham, right? They use the main building at the Botanical Gardens, don't they, for something, for either his Bruce Wayne's school or Wayne Manor itself.
Where I work at the New York Botanical Garden, they shot a couple of scenes. Poison Ivy's little lair was in one of our glass houses, and
There you
they
go.
shot his school there. So yeah, New York, perfect spot, right, for all of this. But that's really like that's a good analogy. Like I learn something new all the time
There
talking.
you go.
This is why these are the kind of conversations that got us gripped on these characters, where you can just your imagination could go wild thinking about it, and it would be so much fun and so interesting. And again, there are those moral ideas that kids would have. So again, we talked about the origin, like he was inspired by all these things. Popeye came out a little before that, so I think again, somebody with powers, all these things at that time that set it up. The name El for the family, that again ties into the Jewish roots maybe of the writer, and he's Kal-El. So more recently, a lot of people were trying that make these stories are embracing the fact that he is Clark Kent. Clark Kent is his identity because he grew up in Smallville. For the longest time, when
Right.
I was growing up, I was always like, Superman is always the real identity. That's when he was really himself. And Clark Kent was always him just pretending to be
The
this kind of
disguise.
mild,
Right.
right. And now, especially now that they're playing up in the comics, he's married to Lois. He has kids with Lois, right? They're like, he is Clark Kent. Clark Kent is who he is. And Kal-El is this kind of just heritage thing where he didn't
Right.
know his parents, Jor-El and Lara from
No, he just sees
Krypton.
them, and if he
Right.
has even recordings or something in the Fortress of Solitude, whatever,
Yeah.
it's like watching old home movies of your parents,
Right.
before they had you or something.
Yeah.
No, it's interesting because I think one of the interesting aspects of the Superman character in general is how the age of the person reading about him in a comic book or watching a movie, and this is true of all fictional characters to an extent, but I think especially for that very American genre of comic book superhero, is that it has to appeal across a little bit of a multiple age group, and then try and hold an audience as the age. And to me, one of the best examples of how that happens and how it changes is when you watch either Superman the movie from 1978 or Superman 2 from, I guess I think it was actually released in 81, although a lot of large parts of it I think were shot together,
Yep.
as I understand it, with the Richard Donner cut, and all that. When you're a kid, you're like, why would you ever give up your superpowers for a woman? Why would you give it up for love? Why would you do that?
Mm-hmm.
Like, people need you. Like, why,
Yeah.
why?
Can't you have
And I
both?
remember being like,
Space.
10 years old and being like, are you crazy? Like, of course you're a kid, that the bad guys are coming, but even then,
Exactly.
why would you do that, Superman? Why would you do that, Kal-El? And I think it speaks to the idea of, no, he's really Clark Kent, and he wants to be human. And that's part of that pop culture, multiple characters who have that desire to be human, whether it's Pinocchio, Mr. Spock, who wants to always better embrace his human side, and even Superman, who just wants to be one of us, and falls in love with Lois, who's also an imperfect character. I think some of the times, one of the things that I've noticed over the years is when you watch certain portrayals of Lois Lane, and of course, everybody's portrayal of Lois Lane is always going to be a little colored by who they first see, whether it's in the 1950s TV show, whether it's Margot Kidder's, portrayal, whether it's Kate Bosworth, whoever. But I've always felt that there's been more of a pushback, and I see it in different Reddit posts and blogs out the web there, that when she's too perfect, people don't like it. They're like, no, Lois is supposed to be
Yep.
a little flawed, and that's why he loves her. She's not like, like, I think some people felt that the Kate Bosworth character was almost too polished.
Yeah, it was kind of a little bland as the way it was
Maybe a
written.
little bland.
You know?
Bland might be a strong word,
Uh,
but yeah,
yeah.
it
Yeah.
was, I would say polished, but yeah, I agree.
Uh-huh.
But whereas Margot Kidder was a mess,
Yes.
smoking and trying her
Typo.
juice
She didn't know how to
press.
spell.
She didn't know how to spell, and it's all this stuff, and that's what made her endearing, and that's what
Yes.
made him fall in love with her, and sort of become the woman that he reverses the rotation of the Earth to save.
Yeah.
In the first movie, and then gives up his superpowers.
Right.
In the second movie, until he realizes, well, that was not a good idea.
Yeah. Yeah. And that scene always, that's one of my favorite scenes of all time, when he just gets so angry because he could have saved his dad and he didn't have the power to do so. And now he's like, maybe I can turn back time and save
Right.
Lois, and a lot of people are like, that's ridiculous. But it's a great moment, one of the best scenes ever in any superhero movie, in my opinion.
Right.
I loved it.
Right. Which is a very human scene, right? It's not about,
very human.
It's not about
Christopher
shooting
Reeve,
a death ray across the earth or something.
yeah,
right?
and Christopher Reeve played it like a fine actor. Like, he took this role that was, a superhero comic book character, and he played it like, all his Shakespearean training and, Juilliard training, gave it his all. So I love that. But before there were movies,
a lot of adaptations, yeah.
Yeah, before movies, there were the radio. That's really where a lot of stuff came from. Kryptonite came from the radio show. The actor who did the voice, Bud, I'm going to mess up his name, Bud Collier. Anyway, he was out for some reason. He had some conflict. So they were like, okay, we're not going to hear his voice a lot. Let's invent this kryptonite thing that's going to knock out Superman for a little while. And now he suddenly hears this great plot device for someone who is so powerful, so invulnerable. Now you suddenly have a weakness that can knock him out, that can kill him, So even someone like Lex Luthor, who has no powers, if he can get his hand on some kryptonite, suddenly he has, even in the later comics, Batman saves some kryptonite in case Superman ever goes rogue. He could use it as a bullet or so. With friends like that, who needs enemies?
Right. Batman, I always think of Iron Man as the Marvel Comics version of Batman, because you're just talking about a very wealthy person who doesn't actually have superpowers.
Yeah.
Just has the ability to produce a lot of hardware.
Yeah.
And neat stuff, but yeah, that's very, to me, that's kind of interesting.
As I got older, I was thinking about that, the fact that, what makes Superman a well-rounded character, because a lot of people kind of gave up on him and said, oh, he's too goody two-shoes, all these powers. It's like two-dimensional. But I'm like, no, he's so well-rounded because it's that human side, and it's that psychological weakness, I think, that gets to him. So the Fortress of Solitude that you mentioned, he goes there to escape and to kind of have a mental health break, I guess,
right,
because he needed things like that. And it's that kind of stuff that I'm just like, that makes him so well-rounded, like the human side of it. And then kryptonite then becomes this other weakness that they use. And then, of course,
a physical as opposed to an emotional weakness, right?
And it's from his home planet. So it's kind of a reminder of, and Lex, Gene Hackman mentions that in the first, he's like, oh, a little token from your home planet,
Right.
So it's not only the radiation or whatever
one has to
it
ask
is.
Scientifically, of course, just how much of Krypton could have fallen towards the Earth.
Exactly.
But right.
And
we'll suspend disbelief
right.
for that little plot device, right?
Yeah. And what is it that is making him now deadly? But human beings are like, doesn't bother me. It's no problem.
Right.
And then all these writers over the years come up with red kryptonite and gold kryptonite, and this, like they're finding different things that have different effects on him. In Superman 3, right, they create some synthetic kryptonite that splits him in two. So you have the the good and the evil, for that great battle that they have. So Superman goes bad and then he splits into two to fight himself, which was the only saving grace in that otherwise really bad movie with Richard Pryor.
And even 4 with the Quest for Peace, I think it was called 4.
The budget just got so bad. But Mario Puzo can't write every screenplay for every Superman movie.
That's true. That's true. You can only That's true.
He came up with some
point.
Good dialogue for General Zod. I mean, I love that. It chewed the scenery, but it was so good. But yeah, so the radio show is what came up with Up, Up, and Away, because that was their way to kind of let people know that he was flying.
You're taking off, right?
Came up with that opening line, faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive, all that stuff. So all these things that then played afterwards. And then you had the cartoons, the Fleischer cartoons, which were amazing. They were like, I don't know if you've seen them, like from the 1940s.
No, I'm gonna have to look up it on YouTube.
They're so good. They're like 8 minutes to 10-minute shorts, and they were filmed so well. And again, even in those, he's still leaping. He's not really flying, but it was really good. And then, of course, the serials with Kirk Allen. So back then, you had like 15 chapter episodes. So like, I can imagine being a kid back in the 40s and just wanting to pay money to just go to movie theaters, see Superman, beat up some gangsters, right?
Exactly.
But then the TV series with George Reeves.
George Reeves
brought him into our living rooms, and kids took it seriously. Apparently, some kids thought they were Superman. They tie like a blanket around their and then try to jump out of windows. And he had to do like public announcements to kind of be like, "Nope, kids, don't do that."
A good movie about that era, I think it's called Hollywoodland. I think it's Ben Affleck who makes a movie where he plays George Reeves.
Okay.
Who's kind of has a tragic life and story arc. He was one of the things about George Reeves that I find interesting is that he was actually in the opening scenes of Gone with the Wind.
Yes.
He plays one of the twins. I forget their names, but one of maybe they weren't twins, but they were brothers who were suitors of Scarlett O'Hara.
Mm-hmm.
And which just for me, when I read that, I was like, oh, I guess he was around a while.
Yeah.
He was already well into middle age.
He was an established actor, yeah.
Yeah, and in that era, and especially in the studio system in Hollywood, that was his shelf life was nearing its end. It's the kind of thing that he picked up this role and he was pretty good in it. But yeah, I mean, it was when I was a kid growing up, I would see those shows, and that was one of those shows before the movie came out in 1978. I remember that show was one of those shows that transitioned at some point into color.
Yes, it started black and white.
It started black and white and had color, and that really changed it. Because all of a sudden the leotards or whatever Superman's costume was much more vibrant and much more obvious and something that you could see, and it emphasized also the grayness, for lack of a better term, right? The gray flannel suit look of the 1950s, the late 50s and early 60s, where everyone else is in shades of gray and white and whatever it might be. But he's this colorful figure, in the shot.
Straight out of the comic books, right?
Straight out of the comic.
And I'm looking at my reflection now, and I realize I've got a little Superman curl going. Not intentional.
Oh, you got the cowlick. You got the infamous cowlick going. Some of us just like showing off how much hair they have, folks. There you go.
Not intentional. So yeah, he's called like the Man of Steel, Man of Tomorrow, the Last Son of Krypton, but you said they bring some of these. You've got Supergirl, you got General Zod, you got Crypto the Superdog, you got these. So how there's even that whole city of Kandor that got
bottled city.
Brainiac captured the city and shrunk it, right? So you have this whole civilization so how much has Krypton really been destroyed? It's like, you got everybody in the Phantom Zone that can be like let go, and probably has in all the stories.
It's a fair question. I mean, and it's interesting that, again, you have to suspend disbelief as with any genre of fantasy fiction, but they look like us, even though their planet is much larger. They should be shorter and wider, and squishier more and whatever. And they all speak English, but amazing. It's but it's still the idea that it brings that science fiction element into what could what could be a much more traditional superhero kind of story. It does bring that science fiction element into it, which, myself being, as a fan of science fiction, it does make it a little more interesting and a little more fun to read and fun to watch some of the different adaptations.
They did a show called Krypton. I forgot what it was on, what network, HBO Max or something. Probably not. Maybe Sci-Fi. But it was set on Krypton, and it was about Superman's ancestor. Just like the comic. There used to be a comic series that was like right around the time of Roots, the miniseries on TV. So they're like, let's do that.
I didn't know that.
Let's do that for Superman. So
wasn't very successful then. About as successful as Caprica.
I mean,
it seems, as the Battlestar Galactica prequel there that Sci-Fi tried to put out.
But the comic book writers always try to tap into what's resonating socially, I guess. But Magic, he's also weak. You've got these characters that use magic on them because magic is fantasy. It's not science fiction. You don't need to
Right.
explain
Right.
it.
But again, then you have, right, you have this circular argument. You can go back, right? What is the line? Is it Arthur C. Clarke's line? I don't know who said it, but any technology sufficiently advanced enough will appear as magic.
Right.
You know, to someone who doesn't understand what is happening. I mean, look at us. We're sitting miles apart from each other, looking at each other on a flat screen. You know, just when we were kids, this would be impossible.
Yep.
And yet, you know, to someone from 1960, this would be magic. You know, this would be like, okay, this is a little magical, over the top kind of stuff, you know.
Yeah.
And yeah, I find it interesting that whether it's actual magic, it brings in that element of the paranormal. Is it something that's really not, that cannot be explained by science or science as we know it? But it's, you know, it's that kind of thing oh, that's a weakness of his. You know, he's susceptible to magic powers. So,
yeah,
you know,
that interdimensional imp whose name I can't pronounce.
Mr. Mixelplick.
Yeah, that's
Mr. Mixelplick.
Yeah, it was great. I love that. So the radio series, we talked about that. It also, the radio series invented the phrase truth, justice, and the American way, which is his truth. And then like later on, a lot of people were like, okay, just like with Captain America, there's storylines where they're questioning government and they're questioning this and that. So is Superman for the whole world? Is it just for America? But it ties
he transitions, right?
Yeah.
He transitions from, and again, this is the flexibility of a character. And then, you know, how much flexibility do you give a character when you create one? He starts in the Depression, you know, trying to right the wrongs and do whatever. Then the war hits and he becomes, you know, a Nazi killer, a Nazi fighter, you know, which you'd expect. And then the Cold War, right? Then the post-war era sets in the Cold War and the, you know, truth, justice, and the American way, you know, comes in. And it's something that is very much seen as a commentary on whatever. And, you know, it's funny, in the 50s, you know, we are an interesting nation. And in many ways, and in the 50s, there was this dichotomy, right, in American thinking about, well, we have to stand up for the nation because of the threat of global communism and whatever was perceived to be this threat, sometimes real, sometimes not. The idea that, well, you could criticize government, right? That's kind of what makes us American and makes, you know, a Soviet or some kind of totalitarian government less so. That's something that a lot of the comic books embraced, you know, more so by the time, of course, a whole other topic, but by the time the 60s hit and Stan Lee starts creating the Marvel universe with sort of the pushback against then, you know, Vietnam, the Vietnam War, the involvement there. But in the early 50s, you know, it was this Cold War, Korean War kind of story where, yeah, we have to stand up for the little guy and, you know, truth, justice, and the American way.
Yeah. And then there was, you know, you could see it also as part of the character because he grew up in this quiet little town, Smallville, raised up with, like, you know, these, I would say, probably conservative values, but then also, like you said, based on what
small
era,
C conservative,
small C, right. And there's also a storyline, all these alternate universes, right? There's a title called Red Son, S-O-N, right?
Yep.
Where he lands not in Kansas, but in Soviet Union, right?
Right.
And grows up to be, you know, this superhero defending the ideals of the Soviet, you know,
right. The hammer and the sickle.
Yeah,
right,
and that's his shield, right? So that's interesting. So again, they could play up on all this. But here's a guy who, like, you know,
nature versus nurture.
Yeah.
There it is.
And that's where, you know, Frank Miller played up, like, the fascist side of maybe Superman versus, you know, the fascist side of Batman, you know, kind of conflicting with each other. Like, who's got the better way to protect society? And, you know, these ideologies start clashing, right? So there's this multiple versions of this character that has lived for decades. So really, really interesting. Then we go into the Superman that we all knew, that we grew up with, the 1970s, Christopher Reeve. I still think they captured it so well. You know, the tagline was, "You'll believe that a man can fly."
Right.
I believed that there could be a character like Superman. Like, it just came to life.
Man.
When you see George Reeve, you see him hopping on a trampoline to jump out a window, and then when he's flying, you know it's a special effect. What they did with the 1978 movie, like, it was incredible. The special effects were top notch, top caliber. You wouldn't have the superhero genre that we have today if it wasn't for that Superman movie, I think.
Right. I mean, those mid-70s movies, which was a fun time to grow up, right? It really was, actually. And especially if you were into movies, into cinema, and maybe a little less so into television. Television had fallen into sort of a bit of a rut, with the three major networks, the three major broadcast networks, and
Yeah.
everything sort of fitting into certain windows. I think the movie network does a good job actually of the movie. You see how it's a movie it's a piece of cinema that does a good job of breaking down the TV industry of the time. But that mid-70s era, right, when all these people that we today look back on and realize, wow, these are great American artists, right? You have Coppola, you have, as you mentioned, Marion Puzo doing writing, you have Spielberg coming along, you have George Lucas, and they create this almost like a new genre of looking at of elements. And now some people, by the way, before I go on, some people say this has now gone too far. That Hollywood can't come up with an original story that
Yeah.
isn't something part of a
It's
franchise,
all an intellectual property that they have to tap
which
into to
I
create a universe or,
I am not in complete, I'll say I'm not in complete disagreement with the folks who say that. I think there's a lot of issues there, but it was in the 70s,
Mhm.
it was fresh.
Mhm.
It was a new take. You had Star Wars, of course, Lucas's masterpiece, which unlocks all of the various sci-fi franchises that can come after it. Basically is the reason Paramount greenlit Star Trek and kept Star Trek alive, and you took it off the respirator and got it off the bed and started moving with that again. And then Warner Brothers, takes its property because at the time, right, Warner Communications, which owned Atari, I believe, it owned Warner Brothers Studios, of course, and owned DC Comics. And so already you have this conglomerate. You see the corporatism starting to sneak in, but they go ahead and they spend the money to do Superman and give him a whole new treatment and do the whole 9 yards. I mean, it's interesting because a lot of it is shot in England. They have some exterior shots here in New York City,
They filmed at the Daily
especially
News
the Daily News
building
building, right, where
for
the Globe is
Daily
on
Planet.
42nd Street there. And it was helped that, of course, you can walk by it today, folks. If you walk on 42nd Street between, just along Second and Third Avenues, you'll see the Globe in the Daily News lobby, which is this giant globe of the Earth, which of course lent itself obviously to become the Daily Planet building because it was just a great piece of location scouting. But a lot of the sets, everything else was built in London. And I think it was at Pinehurst or something, one of the big London studios. But nonetheless, it became seen as this very American piece of movie making. And then I don't know. I know the Salkinds were the producers of the 70s movies, and there's some kind of dispute because they originally had Richard Donner, as we alluded
He
to
was going
earlier,
to do
film.
the
I
second
think he
one
shot
too.
1 and 2 together. They were going to be released separately, but then they only used 1, and then they reshot most of 2
Yep.
again. But there are whole pieces of
It all comes down to money, and it's like,
right,
yeah,
right. Which is kind of sad sometimes,
yeah,
but that's the world we live in.
yeah.
We play the hand we're
And
dealt.
having creative forces there, because you could spend a lot of money. There's a lot of filmmakers that make these multi-million-dollar, epics, and they ended up being duds. So it's just it captured
Sure.
lightning in a bottle. Like it went from superheroes just being B movies, to suddenly being just like with Star Wars. Science fiction was really, B movie fare, right? You got
It
stuff
was
that,
a Saturday
yeah,
serial kind of thing that you would do for the kids, for the afternoon movie, and then you'd usher them
yeah,
out of the theater and have the grown-ups come in for the serious movie.
right. And now suddenly
And
this is what's making the money. These big,
right.
high budget
And
kind
in
of
the
stuff.
days before streaming, movies like Superman, the movie, Superman 2, and as we mentioned, like Star Wars, people would see them multiple times. People would go and see them multiple times. And so that to me is why I always find when you look at sort of the cinematic history of a character like Superman I love when you can find online, of course, this information, but when people control for ticket prices and they say, okay, what actually were the most popular movies like by tickets sold,
Mm-hmm.
not by the money they make. I mean, if you charge $30 to sit in an IMAX seat, sure, you're gonna be making a movie's gonna make a ton more money than Superman the movie did in 1978. But if you control for the cost of the tickets and you just say, okay, how many tickets were sold, then you see like some of these revival of the Hollywood era there from leading into the 80s were really popular movies that really brought back some of these characters and brought them around. And some of those other Superman actors. I mean, I remember Dean Cain playing him,
Lois and
you
Clark
know, in
series.
Lois and Clark, and that kind of made Terry Hatcher as well.
Uh-huh.
I think she was a good balance. She was a great Lois Lane. She was, again, not perfect. She was definitely a little more polished than Margot Kidder, but she was still a great Lois Lane character.
Uh-huh.
And then you had Henry Cavill and
It's
all
like
the other ones
every
all the way up to
generation
Corin
seems to
Sweat.
deserve their own Superman. I mean, you look at how many there's been. I did in my blog a list of all the actors who played Superman, and there was a lot. I put a link on it. There were a Superboy series, and there were, all the Super Friends cartoons, right? The voice actors who played them. It's just been nonstop since 1938. Like, every generation has a new iteration. Now they have video games, right? There's all these games that my son plays.
I honestly, some of these characters, especially since the time we were young, some of these, 60s and 70s franchises sort of were birthed in that era, whether it's Star Wars, Star Trek, et cetera. Their characters, they're only half, they're still decades behind some of the comic book superheroes.
Uh-huh.
And I don't know. In terms of the new stories, et cetera, there are characters, of course, that are timeless and immortal, Romeo and Juliet, some of the characters of great literature, but they're more frozen in sort of, not in amber. It's a little saying much to say they're frozen in amber, because different actors can interpret them differently and bring them to stage or screen, but they don't have these constant story arcs, going on and bringing them through. And that, to me, is what makes some of these characters more interesting and sometimes fun, fun to follow. And sometimes you see, sometimes they fall flat.
Yeah.
Some attempts at doing things are not always the best.
Yeah. And Tim Burton had tried to make a Superman movie. He did such a great job with Batman, with, Michael Keaton. So he was supposed to do a Superman movie with Nicolas Cage, and he had like a little cameo in the Flash movie recently, the multiverse, when they're talking that. But that was, a failure. Like, he really tried to make it, and it just didn't come about. And who knows what direction he would have taken it. A lot more quirky, a lot more different from what you would have seen with Christopher Reeve and others. And then people are like, does he need a cape? Does he need the red shorts and the shield? Like when Joe Shuster drew it, it was just an S, right? Because you had the strong men and you had they would just have like cartoonish kind of character. And now, like, they try to make it into like a Kryptonian crest, a symbol that means hope, right? And I remember another thing I give you credit for, you taught me how to draw that by doing the empty spaces, right?
Right.
I still remember doing that.
It's amazing how, if you draw the empty spaces, then all of a sudden you have this stylized S in this pentagonal diamond shaped crest. Yeah, I have noticed that in a lot of the more recent adaptations, they started using it as sort of a Jor-El's family crest or something.
Family crest.
But
right.
Honestly, our Brando wore it in '78 in that horrible pajama outfit they had him in, for the scenes on Krypton. It's one of those things that I was like, it's just an S, folks. It's like, we got to, let's remember, it's all make believe.
Yeah, if you go by canon, it's like Martha Kent made the costume, right?
Exactly.
She took it and made it.
And she had to use pieces of the wrecked spaceship to be able to sew, because nothing would go through the Kryptonian cloth that he was swaddled in.
All the things they come up with, like how does he shave? How does he shave? He uses his heat vision reflected off of all these things that the writers come up with to kind of fill in the holes that they suddenly say, oh my gosh, how does he shave? How does he cut his hair if it's invulnerable? But yeah, so there's a lot. I'm going to post that link to see all the actors who've played him over the years. We mentioned a little bit the curse of Superman, what happened with George Reeves. So that was something that became part of pop culture for a while, because George Reeves tragically died, from a gunshot wound. And to this day, there's conspiracy theories that, like, was he murdered? Did he kill himself? All these terrible things. And then what happened? It was
self-inflicted.
I forget
what the LAPD concluded, but it's sad.
It is a very sad, tragic end. And then what happened with Christopher Reeve? He still lived a relatively long time after that tragic horse riding accident that he had that paralyzed him. He still made movies, did a lot of charity work to try to do research for paralysis and so on. But a lot of
And
people
his
for the
son
while.
is on ABC, right? His son is
Yes.
on Good Morning America. And every time I see him, I'm like, wow, he's there's some things in there, like some of the mannerisms, he just
Yeah.
reminds me of his dad.
Yeah. Very
But
much
it's
so.
interesting, right? Like if like what you said, Nick, about the idea of him being really Clark Kent being, Superman's primary identity and not the secret identity. It's interesting that one of the people most famous for playing it, his son gets into journalism. Yes, it's broadcast journalism, but it's
Hmm.
journalism
Yeah.
nonetheless. And it's interesting. And also interesting, by the way, that Siegel and Schuster chose him being a reporter as being sort of his secret identity, because it's very much, especially when you think of the 30s and all the different, the newspaper rich environment that mid 20th century America was, right? With everyone thinks we're polarized now. And unfortunately, I think we are way too polarized, but every nuanced point of view had its own house organ.
Hmm.
The Herald was about, was like this kind of person, and the Times was for this person, and the Post and the News and the Tribune and the Sun and the Star,
There
and
was
New
a
York City had,
lot
I
of
don't,
newspapers in New York
yeah.
back then. A
And
lot.
they were the truth tellers, right? They were the ones that would break the stories about corruption and the mob and all of these things. And that's where, you know, the way I remember it being, the way I remember reading about it is that that's where he would keep his finger on the pulse of what was happening
Yeah.
and be able to, sort of keep an eye on things and be able to protect people. It was by being a newspaper reporter, not a policeman,
Hmm.
not a fireman, not what we can traditionally think of as those who protect the weaker, but instead, a newspaper reporter
Right.
for a major metropolitan newspaper, I might add.
Right. And I know the comics recently have tried to kind of make him shift into like a broadcast journalist, or, Jimmy's a podcaster and he's got a, Instagram account and all this, but it's still that idea of him just really being the fastest typist Perry White has ever seen. And, he's telling stories, and, this is a good way to also kind of get the scope of what Metropolis is like. Right? Which I still like about DC compared to Marvel. Marvel sets their heroes in the real world, in New York City, and and all these things. And DC has Metropolis and Gotham and Star City and all these fake kind of towns and cities and Smallville, but it's still the human element there now, especially after the Silver Age when it was all kind of
I mean, I
over the
think
top.
one could look at that as a strength.
Hmm.
It's kind of the one of the positive things about not setting it in a specific place is that wherever you're reading the comic book, you might be able to see yourself there.
Hmm.
It would be way too easy to start to think of things where you'd be like, well, that's New York. That won't happen here. That's likely not to happen here, whatever it might be. But when you just say it's Metropolis or whatever it might be, Gotham, right. It allows people to sort of think, oh, that's kind of like my neighborhood. That's kind of like where I grew up, or that kind of reminds me of whatever, whatever place I was in at night where I
Right.
thought it was being followed, and for a minute I thought it was Bruce Wayne, walking with his parents.
Yeah. So you had a musical version that aired in the 60s, and then it was shown on TV. You've had cereal named after Superman. Back when it first came out, they had a Supermen of America club where you would, send in whatever certificates to get like a ring, a Dakota ring, and a membership card,
Boy,
and so merchandising.
don't forget to drink your Ovaltine, huh?
He was the first action figure. So they made a Superman doll, right? And it sold out so well, and that spawned all these action figures that you see today, right? And it was Superman that set the
Action
trend.
figure, by the way,
You
dolls
can't
for the
call
male
them.
gender.
You can't call them dolls anymore.
He's
So it's
ridiculous.
action figures.
It's like it's
right?
okay. It's
But that's what it was.
Men of America.
Yeah.
It's okay. You like a doll. It's
and
fine.
then you
Thank
had
God.
like G.I. Joe and all these other ones that came after and everything. But it was Superman that set the trend. Peanut butter. Ever eat Superman peanut butter?
No.
I'm like when they're licensing Superman, it's like,
I mean,
I'm sure they were like, peanut butter. Yeah, sure, why not?
that's beyond the pale.
There were board games, pinball machines, roller coasters. You go to any roller coaster, Six Flags, Disney, Universal. I don't know Universal because Universal's not owned by DC, right? But you get them. I think all the DC characters are more the Six Flags chain of amusement parks, but there's a bunch of roller coasters named after them. People get the tattoo of the shield. It's like everywhere you look, it's mentioned so many times in songs.
I mean, when we were kids, the clothing, right? The underoos
The
were
underoos, we
quite the
definitely
thing. Remember
had the bed
underoos?
sheets and the
Those
underoos and the
for
lunch
all your
boxes and
Gen
the backpacks
X listeners. Yeah.
everywhere you go. So an interesting thing, I guess, to wrap it up is what is the future of Superman? The copyright for that original Action Comics series is going to expire in what, 2038? And so even though DC and Warner Brothers still own all the other iterations of it until that copyright expires, people are going to be able to take that original Action Comic version and make their own stories, like they did with Winnie the Pooh, like they did with a bunch of others, Mickey Mouse, the original Mickey Mouse. And it's bad things are going to happen, in my opinion. They're going to do bad things with Superman.
Yeah. I mean, there'll be, I prefer to think of it, Nick, as creativity, right? Let's let, you know, maybe a character like this, maybe at some point, right, it does go into the public domain. You would know more than I, like whether or not like Sherlock Holmes and Hercule Poirot and, you know, some of the classic detective story type of characters are in the public domain and to the extent to which
to some extent they are,
you can use them. Yeah. But there'll be some creative stuff. There'll be some you know, less creative stuff and things that will fall flat on their face, I'm certain.
Yeah.
But that's, you know, in a way that's okay. You know, that's the legacy of, if I was a descendant of Schuster and Siegel at some point, I'd be like, okay, you know what? And I know there was a lot of issues with how they were treated by Warner Brothers and their estates. But at some point you're like, you know, these folks created something that goes beyond what they do now.
Right.
You know, and it goes beyond the original run and it says something for the longevity of the character. You know, it's, in my opinion, it's very similar in some ways to Star Trek in terms of how you could take something and run with it. You know, Star Trek was a very optimistic mid-60s take on, well, this is what could happen 300 years from now or something. And, you know, Gene Roddenberry created it just to sell television time. You know, it was a TV show. He was a TV writer. And the people that have run with it, so to speak, and all its different iterations. And when, you know, Harv Bennett becomes producer and Nick Meyer directs Star Trek II and all of these other elements start happening. And now you have the revival and Paramount Plus and all these things, but, you know, all the different franchise shows. It just goes to show you that you can create a bunch of characters that just can really almost be your legacy. And it's the kind of thing that, you know, I almost hope sometimes that people remember the creators, the original creators of some of these franchise characters. And as you call them, right, the great pop culture characters of our time, that we remember their creators as much as we remember the characters.
That's a great point.
Because it's something that to me is, you know, it takes a little bit of imagination, it takes a little bit of courage to put yourself out there and say, hey, you know, I'm going to write this character and maybe it'll tank, but maybe not, you know, and maybe it'll be something that's interesting. We remember Shakespeare, right? We remember Dickens. We remember a lot of the great authors who create these characters that don't have, you know, they're of course, you know, much more mainstream. They're not endowed with superpowers or whatnot, but Holmes starts to thread there, you know, with his ability to remember things and he does he have a photographic memory of the maps of London and the sewers and all this stuff. And we know who Doyle is, but you know, it would be great if people remember Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster and Bob Kane and Stanley. Stanley's done a good job. I think Stanley is remembered a little more by fandom than some of the DC Comics creators.
But he gets pushed back too because he was the writer. And a lot of people say, well, what about the artists who also came up with a lot of the stuff that made those characters so great? Not to take anything away from Mr. Lee, but, you know, that's also... But there you go.
Comic books are a visual medium.
Yeah.
They're a visual medium. So you can't, you know, like you said, all of the original artists. And, you know, it's funny I know we're sort of wrapping up, but it's funny with this genre specifically with comic books. In our mind's eye, I think it is so visual because a lot of the time when we think of a character, when we think of things like the Golden Age and the Silver Age and all the various iterations of characters, we are thinking of them the way different artists interpreted them. Sometimes the writing could be a little wooden. Sometimes the writing is the same. The character, you know, the writing doesn't change. What changes is the visual depiction of the character. And that's something that pops out, right? Like when you think of Wonder Woman, I think is actually a very good example, right? And, you know, in the 40s when she first comes out, you know, it's a much more demure, sort of almost like cheerleader-ish outfit. Linda Carter's Wonder Woman is, you know, very 70s, you know, long hair, tresses, running around, the lasso of truth. And it's just depending on how she's drawn,
Mm-hmm.
depending how Superman is
Yeah.
drawn, depending how the Fantastic Four are drawn, it lends a lot to the interpretation of how people see a character.
Yeah.
And what is it? Is she young? Like, is Wonder Woman young and more innocent? Diana, from her kingdom, when or is she this very seasoned, savvy person? It depends a lot. Depends on how it's drawn and how the character is depicted.
Comic book medium and now in filmmaking, there are so many hands in shaping these characters and stories that it's like, yes, I like seeing, Siegel and Schuster's names every time there's a new adaptation, but then they didn't invent kryptonite, right? They didn't invent, some of these other characters that came down the road. So all these other people who have added to the lore, added to the legacy, it's like you wish they all could get some credit because it all
Some credit.
shapes it, and it's like I'm glad that more people can kind of add to it and add stories to it and, retcon some of the stuff. And then we talked about public domain, but at the same time, it's such a public figure in terms of popularity and how we all know they've done spoofs and parodies and deconstructed versions of it, right? So I talked about the example that DC did itself about it landing in the Soviet Union, Red Sun. But then there's been other, there's a show on Amazon Prime called The Boys, right? Where they've got a Superman figure who's kind of not very morally good. What if it's Superman
Right.
without the morals? And then there was a show called Brightburn, a movie where a kid lands, he's got the powers of Superman, but he grows up being like, the kid from The Omen, like the devil spawn, right? Pretty bad.
Dear
What if a
God.
kid has these powers and just uses them the wrong way? So all these things that become kind of ways to look at it from a different perspective, a different point of
Right.
view. All stories, I think, worth telling. And then Shazam, I have to just mention him. That was the copyright so Superman spawned all these superheroes, the mimicry and people just making other superheroes. And DC was trying to sue everybody and have them stop. And here's Shazam, Captain Marvel, that's what they called him at the time.
Right.
Pretty much inspired by Superman, but very different. It's like a little boy who uses magic to become this hero.
Shazam.
And the lawsuit lasted so long. Eventually, they were just like, they gave up. And DC bought the character. So now Shazam is part of the DC universe, right? So I just think that's always a great example of the copyright fight and how ridiculous it can be. And just how sometimes it gets out of control. It's like, how much can he really put the genie back in the bottle? He can't, right? Like it's Superman has inspired so many heroes now that you can't say, well, that's not a ripoff of Superman anymore.
No, right. It created a genre. And like you said earlier, the key movie was the 1978 motion picture.
Yeah, I think
Or,
so.
Superman : the movie.
Right.
Because that really introduced sort of the visual language, the narrative, and the audio language. Let's not forget, like John Williams, that's probably one of John Williams's most famous scores.
Yep.
I mean, the man has a
whole
lot of
thing.
famous scores.
The whole thing, the main
But,
theme,
yeah.
the love song, everything.
Right.
It's like it's beautiful.
And when people think of it, like, like we were mentioning earlier, right, about the comic books themselves and the visual depiction, whether it's Superman, Batman, the Fantastic Four, Wonder Woman, whoever it might be, and how they're depicted kind of shapes your interpretation of them. The thing about the movies and television, of course, but especially the movies,
yeah.
because television tended to have just a few audio cues that were just repeated over and over and over, but especially in the 50s. But the movies really had that full orchestral treatment, which you'd be like, whoa, that is tells the story and kind of plays with your emotions while you're watching.
Yeah. Is there anything we left out? I know that we didn't talk about the Henry Cavill movies. We didn't talk about the more recent movie. There's a lot of things that we just can't. You could do a whole podcast. Every episode will be some different aspect of the character because he's so popular. But is there anything like...
I think what's nice about the recent movie, again, like I mentioned earlier, I haven't yet seen it. I do want to see it, but and it's on my list. But from many of the reviews I've read and some of the plot elements, like I know there's, like almost any kind of good comic book and Superman throughout the years, there's a lot of allegory and plot about kind of current affairs woven into it and things that happen, because he is in a way an immigrant. And like both of our families are to the United States. And he's an immigrant to our planet. And so I know there was a lot of commentary on it in that movie. And I'm looking forward to seeing it. I'm looking forward to seeing that latest interpretation of it. And hopefully, it's something that they can do a few more movies on. I think 2 or 3 movies is enough for some of these characters. And then you kind of take a pause and let the next generation pick it up. And you don't need to have like, the crossovers with a million different people and other characters and have the post-credit Easter egg for teasing, the next Justice League mega crossover. And it's like, oh my God. But that's where we mentioned earlier, right? That Hollywood's kind of gotten ahead of itself sometimes, and they got to come up with some original material.
Right.
But
But
we'll
that
see.
movie is worth seeing. I do recommend it. I love
Good.
the fact that he's a human character with all the powers that he has, that humanity comes forth. I like the relationship with his parents and with Lois, and I think it's worth seeing. I love it. All the things that you introduced me to and all the other friends within our circle back then, Star Trek, Star Wars, Superman, Marvel Comics, these are all the things that have kept me young as life stresses attack me, because you escape into these fantasy worlds and these stories. And as you get older, they seem a little bit more like complex, and you can, without losing their fun and their, it's fun. It's great.
It's fun stuff.
Yeah. But anyway, thank you, Will, for being my guest today.
Thanks for having me, Nick. It was a pleasure. And, this was really fun to do and talk about something that still brings back nice, warm memories about, what it's like to curl up with a good book.
Exactly.
Whether it be a comic book or a book itself.
Exactly. And thank you all for tuning in. Please leave a comment, like, share, subscribe. Let your friends know. And if we left anything out, we left a lot out, please let us know. And maybe we'll do another episode, Superman Part 2.
Are there comments? Will there be comments on the podcast?
We'll see who will be the
Put
first
them on down there.
I
always wanted to do this. Put them down there in the comments.
Anyway, thanks for tuning in, and we will see you next time on Greatest Characters in Pop Culture History.